Thank you for coming, everybody. I love to see this packed room. We've got a couple of seats left in these corners if you guys want to come on in. The title of this panel is The Next Constitutional Amendment ? But that's a little misleading because it should be the next constitutional amendment ! So we are going to get the 28th Amendment. I am not a neutral moderator. I'm the founder of the Young Turks. I'm also the founder of Wolf-PAC. But I want to introduce everybody here and get everybody's ideas on how to make that 28th Amendment happen, what are the different avenues, and what's the best chance for success. So let me just go down the road here. Let's start with Ben Gubits. Everybody's going to introduce themselves. He's with American Promise.
Sure. Hi everyone, Ben Gubits, Associate Director at American Promise. Look at all this energy in the room for the constitutional amendment. It's amazing. Give yourselves a hand. American Promise is a national cross-partisan organization that's empowering citizen leaders such as yourself all across the country to make this historic amendment a reality. Not decades from now, but very soon. The amendment is coming, so I hope everyone's ready. And look forward to taking your questions. Appreciate it.
All right. My name is Mike Monetta. I'm the National Director of Wolf-PAC. And yeah, same thing. Thanks everyone for coming. This is going to be a pretty awesome weekend. And real briefly, I guess, Wolf-PAC, we believe very strongly we need an amendment to fix this problem. There are only two ways to get an amendment. One is 2/3 of Congress can propose an amendment that would have to be ratified by 3/4 of our state governments. The other way to do it is you can get 2/3 of the state governments to apply for a convention for a specific purpose, and that is currently what Wolf-PAC has been working on. And happy to tell you more about that later.
All right, next is David Burke, President of Citizens Take Action.
Thank you, and excited to be here. Congratulations on picking the correct panel for this session. As he said, I'm the founder of Citizens Take Action and the author of one of the many constitutional amendment proposals to get big money out of politics. I'm not here to push the specific amendment that our organization is promoting, but rather to promote a specific approach, one of a more unified, organized, and focused movement that is united behind a strong but viable amendment proposal.
All right. Thank you, David. Next is Kaitlin Sopoci-Belknap. Yes, sorry, National Director of Move to Amend.
Thanks. He crammed right before. So I'm going to take a couple more minutes because Move to Amend has been working on this issue since before Citizens United, and our big thing is that it's very important what the amendment says. So our perspective is that this is really at its core a human rights issue. This is our opportunity to answer the question that is the most fundamental question that a society can grapple with. Who will be a person and who will have personhood status? Who will have rights under the law? And that actually is a question that is one that has been asked over and over again in our history, and lots of times we come up with the wrong answer, right? And so the fact that this country was founded on genocide and slavery actually is not an accident that we're in the situation that we are in now, where we have property having more rights than human beings. And so our belief is that the amendment must address corporate constitutional rights and money as speech. Those are the two doctrines that made Citizens United possible, that were created by the Supreme Court, that they had no authority to grant corporations constitutional rights, nor did they have the authority to equate spending money in elections for the wealthy with the First Amendment. And so we have to undo those two fundamental wrongs, and that's what's most critical about what the amendment says. And then in terms of process, it's our belief that what matters most is actually not so much the convention versus Congress, but that we need to build a people's movement. That's the only way the Constitution has ever been amended in the past. That's the only way we'll be able to make Congress act. That's the only way that we would be able to make sure that we had a successful convention process that moved us forward in terms of social justice, not backwards. And so that's what we're striving to create. And it's not about what's possible now in Washington, D.C., or with big funders, or with the two dominant parties that are completely corrupted by corporate money, but rather putting forward an agenda of what we need, what we know is necessary, and then making the movement to make it happen.
Jasmine Gomez is next, Democracy Honors Fellow, Free Speech for People. And Jasmine, I'm going to send the mic over to you, and you answer the first question, and then we'll pass the mic around, okay?
My name is Jasmine Gomez. I'm a Democracy Honors Fellow and attorney with Free Speech for People. And I specifically do legal work as well as education work and grassroots movement work around getting an amendment to overturn Citizens United and other court cases that have allowed for unlimited money to come into our political systems, as well as corporations claiming that they have constitutional rights. So the first question is, what is the 28th Amendment all about? What makes it so appealing to those looking to unrig the system? And what strategies, as a strategy for reform, what are its known strengths and its known weaknesses? And so just to step back a little bit, the movement to pass the 28th Amendment comes in response to a series of Supreme Court cases that have allowed for corporations to claim constitutional rights, and also has allowed for corporations and wealthy individuals to spend unlimited amounts of money in our political system. So because the Supreme Court has made these decisions, there's only two ways that we can actually do anything to change them. So one way is that the Supreme Court itself, we can, push the Supreme Court to change its mind. And that method, however, it doesn't give power to the people. So what that means is that the Supreme Court could decide to change some aspects of it, but maybe not all of the aspects that we think are the most important. Also, it means it's not permanent. So the Supreme Court could decide to change its mind again in the future. So that's what makes an amendment itself really, really valuable. And in order to pass an amendment, you need massive grassroots support. And I think that is a really big benefit in many ways. I think that we can get the most power and the best results when we have the most voices coming together to really talk about what we need to do to make the United States a better place. And that's the only way we've been able to pass the amendments that we've been able to pass, and we've always expanded our democracy. And so that's our goal here too. I would say one of the weaknesses that we see now, and it's something that we're working through, is just there is a division of strategies. There's different ways that we can get a constitutional amendment passed, as was talked about, and there's also different groups of people. There's a dispute as to the scope of the amendment itself. So some people want corporate rights and money in politics in separate amendments. Some people want them together. And so I hope that we'll talk a little bit more about this. But some of those are just like the divisions that we're having. But even so, with that, we always find ways to continue to support each other and work with each other.
You can sense that there's two things we're going for here, which is how do we get the amendment and what's in the amendment. So Kaitlin spoke about what she thinks needs to be in the amendment. I want to hand it over to Mike from Wolf-PAC for a second, talk about the two different ways of getting the amendment and which way you favor, and then we'll move it around.
All right, so as I said earlier, Wolf-PAC is pursuing the second path, ultimately, to get an amendment, which is the convention route. And the reason we're doing so is because, well, for one, we've been actually in this situation before, and a really good example that we like to use from our past is how the 17th Amendment came about, which was in the early 1900s. The people of this country they looked at the way the U.S. senators were elected as corruption, and they didn't like it. So similar, very parallel to what we have today. In fact, the U.S. Senate used to be known as the Millionaires Club. Pretty sure they're both known as the Millionaires Club at this point. But the people started to use every tool available to them to correct that. So they did petitions. They handed petitions into Congress. They passed local legislation. They passed state legislation. The states started asking Congress to propose an amendment for that specific purpose of direct election of senators. And finally, the states started calling for a convention, one by one, for that one specific purpose of the direct election of senators. And they got all the way, just one or two states shy of the 2/3 needed to force a convention, and Congress acted. They said, oh yeah, we're totally in favor of direct election of senators. But it took a lot of pressure. So, we support, Jasmine had said, weakness is that there are a lot of division, there's a division of strategy. I don't necessarily look at that as a weakness. I look at that almost as the opposite, as a strength. And again, history shows us that it's when all groups pursuing many different angles and many different pressure points is finally when reform happens. So Wolf-PAC is really filling that void, honestly, that didn't exist before Cenk created Wolf-PAC, which was the Article 5 sort of piece to the puzzle. And that's what we're doing. We've been doing it for, really organized for about 4 years now. And we've gotten 5 states to do that, to apply for a convention under Article 5, specifically for an amendment that will address Citizens United and related cases. So we got a little ways to go, but that's where we're at.
Okay, so everybody's striking at the root of the problem from different angles. I feel like I've heard that before. Of course, Larry Lessig talks about that all the time. He's a wonderful person in this movement who's instructed so many of us. And that's what we're doing here. But as we strike at that root from different angles, I want to see what we agree upon. So first of all, I'm going to ask a question here. Does anyone think that it can, on this panel, think that it can be solved without an amendment, the issue of money in politics? No. So we all agree. And by the way, this panel is not necessarily representative, of course. There are other groups that do, right? But for the purpose of this panel, we all do agree, and we're going to take questions later if you guys have them. So we all agree that an amendment is the way to go. So then when we talk about the two paths, and I'm going to get to what should be in the amendment later, but when we talk about the two paths, let's just do both. Does anyone think that it is possible to do it through Congress?
Yes.
Okay.
With enough pressure.
Okay. All right. So that's 4-2, kind of.
That's what that looks like, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And there's not with this Congress. Well, that's a great way of putting it. We all also agree not with this Congress. And then does everyone think it's okay to do a convention, or are there objections to a convention on the panel? A little concerns. All right, so Jasmine, let me go to you then with concerns.
I would say one of the biggest concerns that Free Speech for People, the organization I'm with, has is just our current political climate right now. And so there's this fear that a convention might not actually be able to be limited the way that some of us hope. And what that could potentially do is pose serious threats to civil rights, just to voting rights, constitutional rights, different rights that we've been progressing with. We don't want that to be taken back. And so although people have argued that a convention can be limited to reverse Citizens United and that be the only aspect of the convention, it's not really plausible that the number of states that are necessary to want that specific type of convention will come together in that way. I think there's a fear that some of the states might say, well, we'll be open for a limited convention for this and a balanced budget, or something along those lines that expands it to something we don't want, expands it to issues that we're not really addressing or intending to address here too. And also, more importantly, there's no actual legal basis in the Constitution or anywhere that enforces that limitation after the convention was convened. So everything would be on the table, including eliminating or narrowing essential constitutional protections. And also, in the past, the only time that we've seen a convention call, there was actually, the precedent shows that we don't have to necessarily have, it might not need 38 states. They might decide, oh, we only need a simple majority of states to pass whatever convention, whatever call for the convention we need. And that's dangerous too, because if there's no precedent kind of holding it to, and people disagree, and so we'll probably talk about that a little bit too, but a lot of the legal scholars that I work with and at Free Speech for People are fearful of that. And so those are just some of the concerns that we have in this current political climate right now. And that's not to say that our ideas, our minds won't change as Congress changes, but those are some of the fears that we have.
Yeah, I think Jasmine spelled out those fears, and I think one way to think about it is that because the Constitution isn't explicitly clear, then it really is just a question of political power, right? Who has the power to actually make whatever's going to happen? And so, given that, right now, I would say, those of us who want an agenda for social justice and human rights don't really have political power in a lot of the states that we're talking about here. And also in the current context, I mean, one thing I just saw the other day, that this polling and kind of surveying that gets done every single year to look at LGBTQ issues and whether people are getting more accepting and feeling more comfortable with LGBTQ folks. And we have been progressing as a society every year, moving forward, more and more people comfortable, okay with gay marriage, okay with, you know, gay folks around their children, etc. And this is the first year that we moved backwards. And so this is a context, and then think about, you know, people of color, immigrants, women, and the attack on all of these communities. So whether or not legislation, or amendments move forward, or, you know, political perspectives move forward, there will be discussion that potentially the process could be hijacked and kind of move forward. And so at the end of the day, that's why Move to Amend's perspective is we need to build a movement that is clear that this is a human rights issue, that centralizes all of these marginalized communities that I just mentioned at the forefront of our struggle, and connects this issue of not just money in politics, but who will have political power in this country, the wealthy with their corporations or the rest of us, and centers the voices of the people who are the most impacted by the current situation. And if we were able to build that movement, then a convention wouldn't be a scary thing at all. In fact, it might be a wonderful opportunity for even more democracy than just talking about our amendment. So that's what we would like to push for.
I know that Mike and I are chomping at the bit to answer that because we definitely disagree, and it's okay to disagree, and that's what we're doing here, hashing things out and figuring out what the right path is. But I want to get Ben and David involved in the conversation too. Ben, did you have an opinion on this?
Sure. You know, just to be, you know, up front, American Promise doesn't necessarily think that one strategy has to be better than the other at this point in time, right? So Jeff Clements, the founder of American Promise, has a great analogy in that we're all kind of locked out of the house, and it's going to take all of us to get back in, right? We're not going to, you know, knock the guy off the roof that's trying to get in the window, right? So we all have to work together. It's critical that we do. And I think that another thing that's important to recognize is that we should and we will have these debates about strategy, which amendment proposal is best, what's the best route to get there. But one thing that I think that Kaitlin speaks to this as well is we need to build a movement. There are still millions and millions of Americans out there that don't know that this constitutional amendment is healthy, underway, and has real power. Show of hands, how many people in the crowd here know that 19 states have called for a constitutional amendment, right? That's quite a bit, right? Who knew that 800 plus cities and towns have passed local resolutions calling for a constitutional amendment, right? Not as many, right? So part of our job and part of the job of our organizations is to not necessarily say which specific strategy or language is best before we start to really galvanize the energy that's out there for this movement, right? And I think that Cenk asks a really important question is, you know, do we think that getting money out of politics is doable without a constitutional amendment? Everyone on the panel said, no, that's not to say that the constitutional amendment is the silver bullet either, because we know that there will be much work to do with reform after the constitutional amendment. And the great thing about this conference is these reforms drive each other, right? And again, we know that this is not a favorable Congress to the amendment. So there are a lot of great people in this room, other organizations that are working on ranked choice voting, public financing of elections, transparency, anti-lobbying reform, that sort of thing, that will ultimately get us closer to the amendment. So I think it's important to take a step back. While it is critical that we have an agreement on certain strategies, amendment language proposals, but we really have to do a better job of educating our neighbors, spreading the word as much as we can about this historic movement before we get too bogged down in the nitty-gritty and what that looks like.
All right, I'm shocked at how quickly the panel is going. So David, I'm going to come to you next when we start talking about what the amendment should say. So let me just quickly answer from the Wolf-PAC perspective and pro-convention perspective as to why I think some of the stuff that was laid out before is not exactly right. So I'm trying to say it as politely as I can because we all respect each other, etc. But so first of all, the Constitution is exceedingly clear about one thing. 34 states need to call for a convention. 38 states must ratify. The convention is for proposals. It is not that you do not get an amendment at the end of the convention. Under no circumstances. It is crystal clear. 38 states must ratify. And if you want to change that, you'd have to have 38 states ratifying to change that Article 5 clause. So in terms of the right wing gets to make proposals, well, kind of. So I need you guys to understand that there's been hundreds of calls for a convention from different states. From, I believe, 49 different states have called for a convention. So if it was true that we could have an unlimited convention, we would have already had one. We would have had multiple conventions. You need it on one topic. So that has been what the situation is right now. In fact, right now, live calls in Congress are over 34. It's at 35 as we sit right now that Congress has counted, but they're not on the same topic, and hence there is no convention. So I understand the concerns about changing the rules of how the delegates interact and vote within the convention, and those are legit concerns, but at the same time, even if they were to say, hey, you know what, it was for a limited purpose, and by the way, what do you mean by limited? We're talking about campaign finance. There's a lot of different ideas within campaign finance, so those are all good points as well. But in a worst case scenario where they propose those different ideas and they make it through the convention, they still need 38 states to ratify. And our Constitution is wonderful because it allows for revolutions, because it was written by revolutionaries. And so it allows you to do a political revolution. And in fact, the founding fathers, including Jefferson, said you should do one every generation. And we haven't done one in a long time. And so that's why the convention process is there for when Washington gets corrupted. But it is also the most difficult constitution in the world to amend because of the ratification process. You need 38 states, and that is exceedingly difficult. And that actually is a good transition to what should be in the amendment, because we do have to keep that in mind for getting it ratified. So David, let me hand it to you.
Real quickly on the convention issue, I think we need to use every tool in the box, but not put all our eggs in any one basket. So if you're a Wolf-PAC supporter, as I see the gentleman in the t-shirt is over there, continue to support Wolf-PAC, but also support efforts on the federal level to build momentum for an amendment on both fronts. What should an amendment say? Here's the most fundamental truth to keep in mind. Any amendment needs to be immensely popular. 3/4 of state legislatures in a country where it seems like it's a nation divided. The amendment needs to be as popular as things like pizza or sports or music, which means that if Republicans and Democrats cannot both get on board, it's a non-starter. And while I know that corporate constitutional rights is an issue that inspires many people, when both liberal law professors and rank-and-file Republicans are opposed to abolishing all corporate constitutional rights, we have to question whether that's a realistic and viable amendment proposal. The amendment that I wrote, the Restore Democracy Amendment, addresses the Citizens United decision directly and would address Buckley v. Vallejo, which is the other terrible Supreme Court decision that stripped away the power of we the people to enact our own campaign finance laws, without taking away all the rights that corporations and unions need in order to function. Basic rights, like Fourth Amendment protections against searches and seizures, or Fifth Amendment protection against having your property taken by the government without compensation. So the amendment language matters, and we don't have to land on specific language today, but we do need to keep in mind that viability is a critical component if we are going to successfully pass an amendment.
We kind of have, a number of people have said that we need a movement, and I'm sorry, but policy wonk stuff does not make people come to get involved in a movement. What drives people to get into a movement is moral issues and also a sense of hope, not just that the system is so corrupted and so broken that they won't be able to make a difference. And I don't know if we're actually going to get to the questions we had, but there was a question like, why is this so grassroots? And part of that is because the American people don't want Band-Aids. They don't give a crap about any Band-Aids. They're so sick of all that is being offered just being a tiny little crumb of some kind of change of difference. And so when we look at this issue and we look at when we're trying to amend the Constitution, what we need to be looking at is, well, what is actually wrong? And it's not like things were working before Citizens United. I'm sure there's nobody here who would come up to me and say, oh yeah, it was great back in 2009, everything was fine. No American has ever taken me on that challenge and said, yeah, I liked it then, and that's all I want now. And so it isn't about, what the establishment legal community thinks is possible. They'll be the last ones on board. It is not about what, Congress thinks is possible. It is not about what the nonprofit industrial complex DC Beltway groups think is possible, right? It's about what we need and what we know needs to be done. And the reality is that actually Republicans or conservatives, however you want to talk about it, in the streets, when you're out there petitioning, actually believe that corporations should not have constitutional rights either. And we can protect the artificial entities like unions or nonprofits or even maybe for-profit corporations in different ways through legislation at the state and federal level to make clear that they can have statutory protections and privileges, because that's what makes sense. They are artificial entities created by government. The definition of what a corporation has changed over time, and I just hope that we stop thinking so small and so tiny to say, oh, what's permissible, what will be okay, what do the experts think, and actually look at the situation where we have corporate power run amok. It is destroying the planet, it is impoverishing most people, and that is what we need to build a movement to stop. And the amendment is not the only way to do that, but it is a way to wrest control back of our Constitution and stop having it be used against us. And yeah, ending slavery was a crazy idea when the folks who were starting to, organize to end slavery started it. Women having the right to vote was a crazy idea that was ludicrous. That's the kind of culture that we need to shift, and when we shift that kind of culture, then the law actually does change. And I am excited to work with folks who are visionary enough to believe that that's what we can do.
There's so little time left. So, Mike, I want to go to you for a second because look, you're on the ground level. You're fighting to get this amendment, at least get the convention for the amendment, and you deal with Democrats and Republicans. So, what is the Republican perspective? Because if we're going to get 38 states, you need Republicans, even in a landslide scenarios in the future.
Yeah, our perspective is a little bit different. We believe that the strategy that Wolf-PAC is pursuing right now is we're calling for a convention limited to addressing the concerns raised by these court cases, by Citizens United and related cases. And from my experience, just being on the ground literally almost every day, traveling around the country, going from state house to state house. More conservative-minded people, legislators in this country, are not quite there on some of the stronger language, like corporate personhood and money's not being speech. So we found that by allowing for this conversation to take place, what do these court cases mean to our democracy? What do they mean? We're able to bring a little bit more people into the tent. We're able to say that we want your perspective on this. And the legal research around this has really shown us that it was the founders' intent that a convention is supposed to be the place where we deliberate that. The states are supposed to send delegates to that convention. We send experts and we figure out, what can we do to address this. And I don't believe that we have to do everything right off the bat immediately. I think there are some solutions that could come out of that convention that are truly bipartisan solutions that both sides can agree on. Just one example, one amendment that could potentially make it out of a convention and be ratified by 38 states is maybe something like the Udall Amendment that was proposed. That just simply says the states and Congress have the power to regulate their own campaigns, and then you could potentially go state by state. But that's just one possible amendment that would come out of it. But our belief is we got to have the conversation somewhere other than Congress. That's a really important point. And we can figure it out. So we're trusting in the process. And anything that 75% of our state governments agree on should be part of the Constitution, period. I mean, that's how democracy has to work. And, as far as like the legal research about a convention, I haven't seen any. I haven't seen any. I mean, I'm totally open to reading it. So, you can definitely send it to me. I've seen lots of op-eds that quote other op-eds as far as making the runaway convention legitimate. All of the scholarly research that's been done around this, Department of Justice, Congressional Research Service, American Bar Association, Larry Lessig, who is a really big Wolf-PAC proponent. He testifies at committee hearings for us. Jamie Raskin, U.S. Congressman Jamie Raskin. they all point to the fact that anything proposed at a convention needs to be ratified by 75% of our states. But there's also 3 other checks on a convention. I won't go into them, but I'll just mention them. Congress is a check. They have to call it. They're not going to give more power to a convention than they have, so their interest is very much to keep it limited. The court system, this would not exist outside of our American court system. So the states call a convention for a specific purpose, does something else, that can be challenged in our court system. Delegates, they're not like representatives, they have restrictions. And fourth is the ratification. And that's what these legal reports all point to. And again, I've never seen anything other than op-eds that where the opposition and the fear is. So our job is difficult because it's very easy to drum up fear over a convention. It's difficult to go into all of the actual legal research that has been done about this. And it is thorough if you have the time, but you got to have the time.
All right, first one says, Brazil, which has for some time banned corporations from donating to campaigns, continues to struggle with corruption. What work do you think will be necessary once the 28th Amendment is passed?
Yeah, again, I think that's it's important to. Well, Kaitlin said it perfectly that before the Citizens United decision, things were not perfect, right? And this goes long back before Citizens United to the turn of the century, where we have had corrupting influences in our government, mostly wealthy and corporations taking over, and we will need to implement, and also it depends on what amendment is ultimately passed, right? Whether it's the Udall amendment, whether it's something more in line with what Mr. Burke has proposed, what reform comes after the amendment ultimately relies on what is actually in the amendment, which is why this is such an important conversation. But again, some of the other reforms, that I had mentioned before, like lobbying reform, like public financing of elections, anti-corruption measures. These are, critical. I don't know specifically, the cases in Brazil, but I imagine that, most people would agree that our problems are not just policy related, right? We have an actual constitutional crisis on our hands that a matter of policy tweaks and passing bills here or there can't fix, right? Our constitutional foundation has been completely cracked, which is why we need the amendment. And I think that, gatherings like these really raise awareness on what would come next or before, right? We don't have to wait for an amendment necessarily to pass reforms. I think ultimately the amendment is the best route to equal citizenship, equal participation in our government, but there are things that we can do in the meantime, and I think it's up to all of us to participate in this process, right? This has to be a movement in where people actually believe that the constitutional amendment is possible, right? And it seems as though most people in this room would agree, and and most people along party lines agree, right? This is not a partisan issue, and we just got to make sure that the tent is open and wide enough so that people can join, participate in this movement, and again, pass this historic reform.
So real quick, let me add one thing to that, which is that don't get discouraged. Oh, well, this country did that, or in the past this has happened and it hasn't worked. Because we actually had a pretty good system here for a while until Buckley v. Vallejo ruined it. So David and Kaitlin are very right about that. Citizens United shot a dead horse. Buckley v. Vallejo and Bellotti is another really important case. And once those declared that money was speech and you could give unlimited money in one way or another to politicians, that's what ruined our system. But before that, you actually had to commit a crime to bribe a politician. I know today in America that seems like, really? Why can't you just bribe them, right? And because they made it legal now. But in the old days, you actually went to jail for bribing politicians. That's why it wasn't done as much, and we had relatively clean. Now it's just open season. It's an auction. Going once, going twice. Mitch McConnell, okay, 28 million, right? So we can get back to that time and get real change. I'm going to read another question here. Other groups are calling the 28th Amendment the Balanced Budget Amendment. How does this conflict? And I'll take that one because I'm trying to make it as quickly as possible, and then the next question I'll hand over there. So it doesn't necessarily conflict. Like voting, conventions are nonpartisan. So Republicans are allowed to vote, Democrats are allowed to vote. Republicans are allowed to suggest conventions, Democrats are allowed to suggest conventions. And sometimes they'll agree on a convention, sometimes they won't. Democrats do not agree to a balanced budget amendment. It has passed in 28 states, but since it is not able to combine with the convention of the states or free and fair elections or any of the other calls, we have not had one, thank God. And so I'm a huge believer in conventions, but not in every convention, and that's an issue that I don't happen to agree with, but you can have different conventions for different topics. All right, now next question is, how will this movement avoid the failures of the ERA? Many of us thought that had popular support as well.
Actually, I think that the biggest thing that the Equal Rights Amendment, which would be equal rights for men and women, had going against it is that there was a strategic decision way early on, before the 1980s push for the Equal Rights Amendment, that instead of fighting for equal rights at the very beginning, back before women had the right to vote, they would strategically decide that they would just go for the vote rather than full equal rights for women, because that would be easier to get. And the logic of the Susan B. Anthonys and Elizabeth Cady Stantons and the more privileged folks that were in that movement, and I have much respect for them, of course, but was that a pragmatic question. We need to go for the easier option, and then once we get a right to vote, then of course we will elect politicians, and then they will vote for an equal rights amendment, because why would they not? Because they will be our politicians, right? And so here we are today in 2018, and we don't even have an equal rights amendment for women in this country because there was a strategic decision that that would be too hard, too much, and so we'll go for the easier solution first, which still took 70 years to get done. So I think part of the problem is that if we don't actually push for what we really need and what must be done, then when we compromise later, we're compromising ourselves and we find ourselves not having gotten very far in this agenda. So that's what I would say. And because I am an organizer, I'm going to take a second to pass. It seems like people really want to have this conversation about the amendment. Unfortunately, there's not that many spaces in this conference to do that. So this is a conference that we're having in June in Washington, D.C. that I'd love to invite you all to. So I'm going to run around and pass this about.
Move to amend constitutional amendment to abolish all the constitutional rights of corporations and unions has been kicking around in Congress for 5 or 6 years. One Republican supports it after 5 or 6 years of consistent lobbying and effort. This idea that corporate constitutional rights are the fundamental problem and anything less is a compromise is a false narrative. We don't ignore what experts say. How would you feel if on the issue of climate change, someone told you, don't listen to the scientists, don't listen to the nonprofit industrial complex that wants to fight climate change? I think you'd be taken aback. So when I urge you to think critically about a constitutional amendment, and you don't have to listen to me, but I do ask that you do your homework, learn about corporate constitutional rights and the different amendment proposals and an Article 5 convention yourself, because that's how we do our job as citizens. Not by taking action on what riles us up the easiest, but by learning the issues and making a concerted effort to do what needs to be done.
So I just wanted to respond a little bit too about corporate rights and the fears around eliminating all corporate rights. So individuals will still have all of their constitutional rights, and individuals can sue through associational or third-party standing, depending on if it's an organization or a corporation or whatnot, if their individual rights are being violated. And so they can still use the corporate entity to bring forward lawsuits. And like Kaitlin mentioned, we can also pass legislation to protect corporations in whatever way we want to, and including other like unions and nonprofits and stuff like that. So while there are, there are some concerns about corporate constitutional rights being eliminated, there are also legal scholars who have done a good job at talking about associational standing and third-party standing and other avenues in which individuals will still maintain their own rights, and corporations won't be usurping individual rights.
On this one, I agree with Jasmine and Kaitlin. And look, within Wolf-PAC, there's also disagreement about what exactly the amendment should say, which is healthy. And by the way, it's nonpartisan, and there are Republicans who have good ideas who actually do want to do campaign finance reform. So there's one that was in New Hampshire, the person who suggested, look, I don't mind getting donors from in-state, but I don't know why out-of-state guys get to donate into in-state, and that's the one I'd like to propose at a convention. Great, wonderful, that's the whole point of a convention. So I happen to think that corporations, this is a wild, let's do this real quick because I think you'll enjoy this. Raise your hand if you think a corporation is a human being. Let the record note that no hands were raised. So I don't think that they have constitutional rights endowed by their inalienable rights endowed by their creator. We're their creator, and there's nothing inalienable about their rights. That doesn't mean they don't have any rights. If you take away constitutional rights, they still have legal rights, the rights that we have decided to give them. But let's go to the convention, let's have those debates, let's come up with proposals, and then see who can ratify it in 38 states. So now, there was a couple of good questions in here, including from a conservative, but I could only read half of it. The handwriting was an issue, sorry. So I'm going to go to this one. Just because the Constitution has no rules for how a convention would work, does that really mean there are no rules, or can you find rules in other sources like the Due Process Clause or the ordinary law of agency?
I can answer. I'll be quick, so we don't have to get stuck on the convention process. But these reports that I mentioned earlier, like Congressional Research Service, they point out that, yes, if we get to the point of a convention, again, historically, it's more likely that if the states get to a critical mass, Congress will propose an amendment on whatever subject that happens to be. But if we get there, there will be lots of resources for Congress. We've had over 200 constitutional conventions at the state level, so we know how this process works. Conventions are extremely familiar to just us as a country. So, and that is what these legal reports point out. So I'll keep it short. I won't get into it.
Okay. Next one. So many great questions here. What will your organizations do to support candidates who are supportive of the push for a 28th Amendment and will work in office to get it passed? And I could add a corollary to that. What will your organizations do to the ones who are not supportive of the 28th Amendment?
So we've had a campaign for the last many years, and it will be going big in 2018, called Pledge to Amend, where we target folks running for office and ask them to take a pledge to use their office to support the amendment. That's not just folks running for Congress or president or state legislature. Folks running for city council should actually be thinking about this question as well. And also, the people who run for city council now are likely to be state legislators when the amendment actually comes up for ratification, and those folks are likely to be the most likely ones to be in Congress. And so starting early, educating folks who are interested in serving the public, that the way that they need to do it is by supporting this amendment effort and using their office to do so. And so we're a 501c4, so we don't work explicitly on candidate campaigns at this time, but we have our Pledge to Amend campaign and ask them to take a stand, and then let our base and our supporters know, in their elections which candidates are for the amendment and which ones aren't, and they get to say that in their own words. So I would encourage anybody running for office, anybody who's working on anybody's political campaigns at any level, to encourage your candidates to take the Pledge to Amend. And then we have our grassroots folks get involved in bird dogging candidates and making sure that they know that they need to tell us where they stand. And ultimately, we need to make this a litmus test issue for voters. So we actually have a voter component to Pledge to Amend, where voters would pledge to only vote for candidates that support the 28th Amendment. And so that's how we tackle it.
Wolf-PAC has spent good time, energy, and resources to support people who voted for their resolution. They've also spent good time and energy eliminating politicians who didn't. That's why it's called Wolf-PAC. So, and I remember in Connecticut, somebody complained, well, that's ironic. You guys are spending money in politics to get rid of money in politics. I said, yeah, I know. There's one way to fix that. Okay. So here's another good one that could be viewed as conservative question. Should term limits be part of our reform amendment? The deck is never more stacked than when an incumbent defends his own seat. This would create more balanced open seat races. It is also very popular and bipartisan.
Sure. Again, I think that this gets back to what the actual amendment says, right? There are multiple amendment proposals that are in Congress, multiple organizations that are backing different amendment proposals. We're working with an organization called Fix It First America. Our good friend Steve Lipscomb here in the crowd supporting that amendment. That was introduced in the New Hampshire legislature, and that actually has a component to end extreme partisan gerrymandering along with it as well, right? So again, there are a ton of different proposals that we can look at and have these really important debates, have experts weigh in, have the general public weigh in on what the actual amendment should say. I don't particularly have one way or another thinking on term limits, but I think that it's an important piece of the conversation. American Promise is spearheading a national program called Writing the 28th Amendment, which many panel members are a part of, where we are having an open and deliberative process to bring in experts, judges, lawyers, and as well as average citizens all across the country to participate in this historic process. Because again, and it gets back to what I was saying before, is millions of Americans still need to be involved in this process. We think that they should have a say in what the amendment says as well, not just folks that work at nonprofits, not just lawyers, not just judges, et cetera. And so I encourage you to go to AmericanPromise.net and check it out. It's a great program, and we think ultimately will lead to a consensus amendment that we can all get behind. So check that out.
All right, we're doing a good job of getting through the questions. Okay, so one other quick one, and then we're going to get to one that's a little trickier. And by the way, term limits, we'll see you at the convention. Propose it there. Okay. Why aren't more congressmen calling openly for this amendment? Because they're corrupt. Okay. No, but seriously, think about it this way. They got power in this system. So why would they want to change this system? It doesn't work for any of the rest of us, but for the national guys, not the state guys, not the local guys, but for the national guys, they love this money in politics because they're good at raising money. They're millionaires themselves. They know a lot of millionaires. That's how they got there. If it turns out that you change the system on them, they're screwed. So that is part of my rationale for this Congress ain't never going to pass it. So that's why I think this state's the better way to go. Or change the Congress, but you're going to have to do it on a mass scale. Go ahead.
I think we've got to be careful in how we talk about members of Congress or Congress as a whole. Representative Ted Lieu is my congressional representative, and I've met with him about this amendment, and he's a knowledgeable, good person, in my opinion, who does not like having to raise the amounts of money that he has to raise. And in my experience working in Congress, many members of Congress are not fans of big money in politics, and in fact, over 100 already support amendments to fight back against big money in politics. I think one of the reasons this isn't on the tip of people's tongues and why it's difficult for us to succeed is because while this is an important problem, one of the most important, it never seems like an urgent one. It's not the kind of thing you can just call your rep about and tell them to vote this way tomorrow. And it's not the kind of thing that you can only focus on intermittently. So I think as we get closer, we will see more members of Congress tooting the horn and speaking about amendments. But frankly, we have a lot more urgent things to deal with right now in this country.
So there are a couple of good members of Congress. Granted. Ted Lieu, Jamie Raskin, Ro Khanna, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren. I'm almost out. Okay. Okay, let's go to the next question. I can spend all day on that one. Okay. This sounds too optimistic, the writer writes here. Why would a red state vote to have a convention on this topic? How would it be in their political self-interest? Really good question.
I was just going to say, so just very quickly, yeah. There are a number of red states that have been in favor of this proposal. There's a effort to put a question on the ballot in Wyoming in 2018 that has a convention proposal attached to it that is a call for amendment. I'll remind everyone, in 2012, the state of Montana passed a ballot initiative that won 75%. That same year, Mitt Romney won by 10 points. Right, so there are many red states that would consider this a viable solution and good reform.
Yeah, just real quick, the short answer is moderate Republicans don't want to be wiped out by extreme Republicans. And it happens all the time. I was recently in Nebraska, and somebody was telling me, Republican state senator there was telling me that 5 reasonable, well-liked, moderate Republicans were attacked by big money during the last election and were wiped out. and replaced by extremist. So, that goes back to Wolf-PAC's bottom line, which is we have really three things: urgency, history, and courage. And this is incredibly urgent that we fix this problem because, there are a lot of reasonable, good conservatives at the state level right now. Same thing with the Democrats, but big money is coming down for the state level too. So we really do have to be acting with urgency up here. And someone said in a panel earlier, the urgency of collaboration, which is, I think, a phrase that we can all agree on, I hope, moving forward too.
One thing I would say on the conservative side of things, why would a red state support this? States' rights. Shortly after Citizens United, the state of Arizona, the voters passed a publicly financed election system to combat the corruption in their state. 9 unelected judges struck it down, even though the public financing system didn't restrict the speech of a single individual. So red states want reform too, and states' rights is an important argument in favor of an amendment for red states.
On that note, and then again, it's a note of optimism here because we've seen it actually at the different state levels. First of all, when you go to the voters, we're in great shape. 93% of Americans believe that politicians serve their donors and not their voters. So it is the most bipartisan issue in the country, period. So when you go to ask Republicans, are your politicians corrupt? They universally say yes. Democrats say yes, Republicans say yes. And by the way, if you want to talk to Republican friends, colleagues, family members, ask them a simple question. After they say yes, they're corrupt, because they almost all will, who do you think corrupted them? Okay, those are the donors. Okay, those are the special interests. They'll say, oh, Soros and Bloomberg. Okay, fine, but also Koch and Mercer. They'll say unions. Fine, also corporations. So let's get all of the money out. So we are going to go to the grassroots. All these groups are in their own ways. Democratic grassroots, but yes, Republican grassroots. They are our allies on this issue. And some of them are in this room, okay? And some of them are watching out there. And this is the one thing that really, really is nonpartisan. And it's us versus the current Democrats and Republicans at the national level. So together, the citizens can actually do this and have done it every single time. All right, so how can people help your groups?
Sure. First thing you should do is go to AmericanPromise.net. AmericanPromise.net. One of the things that American Promise does is it empowers citizen leaders to do this work, right? Whether it is passing a local resolution, whether it's trying to put something on a statewide ballot initiative, whether it's trying to get a resolution passed through the legislature. I think all too often, so many groups will kind of slap up an online organizing toolkit for people to download and then say good luck. American Promise has a much different perspective in that how do we support, empower, and connect people to do this historic work? It's going to take so much more than just online toolkits to do this work, right? So starting chapters, American Promise associations, where we learn about grassroots lobbying, writing letters to the editor, building public awareness, educating the community is such a huge piece to building this movement. So check out AmericanPromise.net. I hope all will get involved. I'll be around the entire conference if you want to pull me aside and ask me a little bit more, but appreciate everyone's time, and it's been fun. So thanks.
All right, and actually, if you're in this room, you can get involved even sooner than that, right?
That's right. Yeah. American Promise is hosting a amendment reception at the Howlin' Wolf starting in about an hour or so. So hope you guys RSVP, and we'll see you guys there. Yep. So, I hope you RSVP in advance. Come on by. Yeah.
So for us.
Yeah, that's right.
So for us, if you want to get involved, the website is wolf-pac.com, which you've heard Cenk probably say 1 million times on the show. Wolf-pac.com. And same thing. I think I think we can all agree that one of the most important things that we can all do is just get involved. And that's something that we stress a lot at Wolf-PAC is not just learning about our path, to get this amendment and get corruption out of our government, but just how to get involved. It's amazing how many people don't realize how easy it is to meet your state legislator. I mean, just so many people come to us and they don't even understand that you can just call them or go to a committee hearing and testify. So one of the things that we really pride ourselves on is getting people into the State House and building relationships with your legislators. In states where we've passed our resolution in, our volunteers are working on other pieces of good government legislation now, because this is an ongoing process, and it's not, even if we get the 20th Amendment, it's not a silver bullet, to go back to that. This is always going to be an ongoing process. Democracy is hard work, and it's messy, and it's going to be evolving forever. So I think the most important thing that anyone can do is just learn how to get involved, and we definitely spend a good amount of time teaching our volunteers how to do that. So that's it. Thanks for coming.
If you want to learn more about what we're doing at Citizens Take Action, visit citizenstakeaction.org. I'm here for the rest of the conference, so you can come talk to me. I don't travel with an entourage. I would, but I can't find 3 people willing to travel with me. I want to say that earlier I talked about how this is an important problem, but never seems like an urgent one. If you care about getting big money out of politics, make a commitment to yourself to work on this consistently every now and then. It doesn't have to be your #1 issue or the #1 destination for your donor dollars, but put in the time to build a relationship with your representative or get endorsements for one amendment proposal or another. Consistently work on this issue, and through enough pressure and enough time, we will get to where we need to be. Thank you.
So Move to Amend is at movetoamend.org, and we've been working on this issue for 8 years. Like I said, we actually were working against corporate constitutional rights before that. We are grassroots based as well, so we have chapters all over the country, and if you want to get started with working with us, that's the best way, is to find out if there's a group near you or to start one up. We're the only amendment group with a strategic plan, which is written in order to be transparent and accessible and available and open to feedback, and so I have some copies here, but you can also find it at movetoamend.org/plan. Like I said, Pledge to Amend is a big campaign for us this year. I hope everyone will join us June 8th through 11th in Washington, D.C. And our amendment is called the We the People Amendment. It's House Joint Resolution 48. And we need to get it introduced in the Senate. And we're getting a lot of runaround from senators saying, oh, this is important and we'll co-sponsor, but we won't take the lead, even the folks that you would think would. And so we need you to call them. If you live in Rhode Island, please come see me. If you have any good friends in Rhode Island, please come see me. Senator Whitehouse is one of our main targets, but we don't have a group on the ground in Rhode Island. And so if you live there or know somebody who does, it'd be really helpful. But every state has active Move to Amend folks, and we can hook you up. And so please come check us out, and thank you. And please let Represent Us know that this issue is really important when we're talking about money in politics, and that the amendment discussion should be really central to any conversations about getting money out of politics.
So I want to end by saying Free Speech for People isn't as grassroots as a lot of these other organizations. We do have educational materials and frameworks, and I personally work with a lot of the grassroots activists in a variety of the different amendment movements. But with relation to urgency and how these issues don't maybe necessarily seem as urgent, I actually created a framework that centers grassroots activists that come from marginalized community members and have them highlight and discuss the issues that are most important to them, and then correlate it to how money in politics is affecting those issues. So right now, a lot of the conversation that we see is about court cases or how much money is being raised or what corporations are benefiting from it, but we don't see how it affects the policy. So a lot of the work that I'm doing is trying to also analyze how we can approach grassroots groups better with like showing, hey, this issue is affecting you directly. So for example, I wrote a report on how money in politics affects immigration policy, and you could find that at freespeechforpeople.org, as well as the framework that centers individuals from marginalized communities. We also did a series of events including with Move to Amend and American Promise, around the country on how money in politics affects queer and trans rights. And not just money in politics, but also corporate rights. So if you want access to any of those materials, definitely go to freespeechforpeople.org and absolutely get involved with all of these groups in the grassroots level as well.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. We really appreciate it. I love that you care about this topic. I love the enthusiasm in this room. Let's go take that to the streets. Whichever side of the route you want to strike at, have at it, Hoss. But let's take that tree down, and let's get democracy back for the people. Thank you.